The autumn breeze swept through Washington, D.C.'s streets as the sun began its lazy descent behind the city's iconic buildings. At Lincoln High School, the debate club was just wrapping up their weekend practice session. Among the students packing up their notes and laptops was 16-year-old Diana Chen, whose passionate argument about climate change had impressed even the club's advisor. Diana loved these Sunday afternoon sessions. They gave her a chance to shine away from her father's political spotlight. Being the daughter of a state senator wasn't always easy, but in debate club, she was just another student with a voice and ideas of her own. As she stepped out of the school building, Diana pulled her phone from her jacket pocket, scrolling through the dozens of encouraging texts from her best friend about their upcoming mock trial competition. The late October air felt crisp against her face as fallen leaves crunched beneath her feet. The crosswalk signal turned white, and she began making her way across the street, still smiling at her friend's messages. That's when everything changed. Officer Richard Miller was having what he called a rough day. His morning had started with an argument with his captain about his aggressive approach to patrolling certain neighborhoods. He'd spent years on the force building a reputation, though not the kind that made his department proud. His colleagues whispered about his old-school methods and his obvious biases, but nobody ever confronted him directly. Through his windshield, Miller spotted Diana in the crosswalk. His foot, which should have pressed the brake, instead found the accelerator. Perhaps it was the bad morning, or maybe it was something deeper, darker, that made him do what he did next. The police cruiser surged forward. The screech of tires against asphalt pierced the peaceful Sunday afternoon. Diana looked up from her phone just in time to see the black and white police car racing toward her. Time seemed to slow down as her debate notes scattered into the air like startled birds. She tried to move, but it was too late. The impact sent her flying. Her phone shattered against the pavement, the screen going dark mid-message. Nearby pedestrians screamed. A street vendor dropped his coffee and ran to help. Someone started recording with their phone. Another person shouted for an ambulance. Officer Miller stepped out of his car, not to help, but to start building his story. He barely glanced at Diana's motionless form as he pulled out his notepad, already crafting the narrative that would paint her as the one at fault. She came out of nowhere, he muttered to himself, knowing full well the crosswalk light had been in her favor. What Miller didn't know was that a nearby coffee shop's security camera had captured everything. He also didn't know that the unconscious teenager lying on his cruiser's hood was the daughter of one of the most influential state senators in D.C., a man who had been fighting for police reform for the past decade. As the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, a crowd gathered around Diana. A kind elderly woman held her hand, whispering words of comfort even though Diana couldn't hear them. A medical student from a nearby university checked her pulse and kept her neck stable. The community rallied around her, strangers becoming protectors in an instant. Inside the coffee shop, the manager reviewed the security footage with trembling hands, knowing she held irrefutable evidence of what had really happened. She made 3 copies before anyone could arrive to ask for them. The autumn sun continued its descent over Washington, D.C., its warm light falling on a scene that would soon spark a chain of events nobody could have predicted. A young girl's Sunday afternoon debate practice had become the opening chapter of a story that would shake the foundations of a city's power structure. All because one police officer made a choice that would prove to be his last act of unchecked prejudice. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Officer Miller sat at his desk, his hands hovering over his keyboard. He'd been staring at the blank incident report form for 20 minutes, trying to figure out how to twist the truth into something that would protect him. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, untouched since his supervisor brought it to him an hour ago. "Just write what happened," Lieutenant Brooks had said, placing the mug on his desk. But they both knew that wasn't what he meant. Brooks had been covering for officers like Miller for years, burying complaints and losing paperwork when necessary. It was an unspoken agreement that had kept many careers intact. Miller started typing, his fingers heavy with the weight of the lies he was crafting. Pedestrian failed to observe traffic signals. He wrote, knowing full well that the crosswalk light had been white. Subject appeared suddenly. He added, though the security footage would show Diana had been clearly visible for several seconds before he hit her. Down the hall, Officer Chen, a rookie who had witnessed the aftermath, stood in the break room, struggling with what she'd seen. She'd watched Miller's face when he got out of the car. There was no shock, no remorse, just annoyance, as if Diana had been an inconvenience rather than a victim. The memory made her coffee taste bitter in her mouth. Meanwhile, at City Memorial Hospital, doctors worked frantically to stabilize Diana. Her injuries were severe: a broken leg, 3 cracked ribs, and a concussion that kept her unconscious. Nurses moved efficiently around her bed, their faces grim as they attached monitors and checked vital signs. One nurse gently wiped away blood from Diana's face, revealing a deep cut that would need stitches. Back at the station, Lieutenant Brooks called Miller into his office. The blinds were drawn, and the room felt smaller than usual. There might be some security footage, Brooks said quietly, his fingers drumming on his desk. I'm sending someone to handle it. They both understood what handle it meant. Officer Chen watched through the break room window as a patrol car left the station, heading toward the coffee shop where the incident had occurred. Her stomach churned. She joined the force to protect people, not to watch her colleagues cover up their crimes. The hospital waiting room filled with Diana's friends from debate club. They sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, still clutching their notebooks from practice, as if holding onto them might somehow help their friend. The team captain kept checking his phone, hoping for updates, while another member quietly cried into her sleeve. At the coffee shop, the manager, Mrs. Wu, watched as 2 officers entered her store. They were polite, professional even, as they asked about the security footage. But Mrs. Wu had been in America long enough to know how these things could go. The real footage was already safe, sent to 3 different email addresses. What she handed over was footage from yesterday, showing nothing but ordinary afternoon traffic. Miller finished his report late that evening. Each lie felt heavy as he typed it, but he'd done this before. Usually, it worked out fine. A complaint would be filed, then dismissed. The victim would be discredited or discouraged from pursuing it further. The system would protect its own, as it always had. What none of them knew was that Diana's phone, though shattered, had been recording audio for her debate practice notes. It captured everything: the screech of tires, the impact, and most importantly, Miller's muttered comments afterward. A tech-savvy nurse had carefully secured the device, noting how its light still blinked, recording. As night fell over the city, different players in this unfolding drama went home with their secrets. Officer Miller to his empty apartment, Lieutenant Brooks to his family dinner, Officer Chen to her restless conscience, and Mrs. Wu to her quiet satisfaction at having outsmarted those who thought they could intimidate her. Meanwhile, Diana's phone continued recording in a hospital evidence bag, capturing the beeping of monitors and the whispered prayers of nurses, bearing silent witness to the truth that would soon shake the entire department to its core. The state capitol building buzzed with activity as lawmakers debated the annual budget. State Senator David Chen sat in the front row, half listening to his colleague's speech about infrastructure funding. His mind kept drifting to his daughter's debate competition next week. She'd been practicing so hard for it. The gentle vibration of his phone barely registered at first. 3 missed calls from an unknown number. Then a text: Senator Chen, please call immediately. It's about Diana. She's at City Memorial Hospital. The world seemed to tilt sideways. His papers scattered as he stood up abruptly, drawing confused looks from nearby senators. The chamber's marble walls suddenly felt like they were closing in. Without a word to anyone, he rushed out, his footsteps echoing through the historic halls. In his car, his hands shook as he called the hospital. The nurse's words came in fragments that pierced his heart like shards of glass. Hit by a police car. Serious condition. Unconscious. Surgery required. Each word felt like a physical blow. Traffic lights blurred past as he drove, barely registering the colors. His mind raced faster than his car. Diana had always been careful crossing streets. She'd joke about it, saying she'd inherited his overly cautious nature. Something wasn't adding up. As he pulled into the hospital parking lot, his phone rang again. This time, it was his old friend from law school, now a civil rights attorney. "David, I just heard. There's something you need to know. The officer involved, he has a history. This wasn't an accident." The hospital corridors seemed endless. A nurse recognized him from his campaign posters and quickly led him to the ICU. Through the window, he saw his little girl, the one who'd sat on his shoulders at protests, who'd helped him write speeches about justice, who'd inherited her mother's fierce determination. She looked so small among all the medical equipment. The doctor approached with a tablet showing x-rays and medical charts. She explained Diana's injuries in detail. The broken bones would heal, but they were worried about the head trauma. They needed to monitor her closely for the next 48 hours. While the doctor spoke, David's phone kept lighting up with messages. News was spreading. Local reporters wanted statements. Fellow politicians offered support. But one message stood out. A link to a social media post showing the aftermath of the incident, filmed by a bystander. In the waiting room, he watched the shaky footage. His hands clenched into fists as he saw the officer's casual demeanor, the way he didn't even check if Diana was breathing. Years of maintaining political composure crumbled as rage and grief fought for control of his emotions. A young officer, Chen, according to her badge, approached him hesitantly. "Senator," she said quietly, looking over her shoulder, "I was there after it happened. What's in the official report? It's not what really happened. I can't stay quiet about this anymore." David had spent his career fighting for police reform, pushing for accountability, demanding change. He'd faced opposition, death threats, and countless setbacks. But he'd always maintained his professional distance, approaching it as a policy issue. Now, watching his daughter fight for her life because of the very injustice he'd been battling, everything changed. His phone buzzed again, this time from the coffee shop owner near the accident. "I have the real security footage," the message read. "They tried to get me to hand over yesterday's tape instead, but I kept the truth safe." As evening settled over the hospital, David sat by Diana's bed, holding her hand. The steady beep of monitors provided a rhythm to his thoughts as he planned his next moves. He'd worked within the system for years, trying to change it from the inside. But now the system had hurt his baby girl, and he would use every ounce of power he'd accumulated to tear down its walls of protection. Outside Diana's room, protesters began gathering. Word had spread about who she was, about the officer's history, about the attempted cover-up. Their candles flickered in the growing darkness, a vigil for justice that would soon become a movement. David looked at his daughter's face, so peaceful despite the injuries, and made a silent promise. This time, change wouldn't come through polite debates and careful compromises. This time, it would come through the unstoppable force of a father's love combined with the power of a position he'd spent decades building. The system had no idea what was coming. Morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of the city's Civil Rights Division office as investigator Patricia Rodriguez spread out documents across her desk. She'd been up since dawn, reviewing Officer Miller's personnel file, a stack of papers that painted a disturbing picture through both what was there and what was suspiciously missing. Her coffee grew cold as she traced patterns of complaints that had mysteriously disappeared, witness statements that had been altered, and incidents that had been downplayed. Each page added another piece to a puzzle she'd spent years trying to solve. Now, with Senator Chen's influence forcing an independent investigation, she finally had the authority to dig deeper. Her phone lit up with a text from Officer Chen, the rookie who'd come forward. "Found something in the station's backup server. Deleted dashcam footage from previous incidents. Can we meet somewhere private? Across town, Lieutenant Brooks paced his office, phone pressed to his ear. We need to handle this carefully, he muttered to Miller on the other end. The senators got pull with the governor. This isn't like before. His free hand shuffled through papers on his desk, incident reports from years past that suddenly felt like taking bombs. In a small coffee shop far from the station, Officer Chen sat in a corner booth, nervously checking her phone. She downloaded the files to a secure drive, but even that felt dangerous. Other officers had already started treating her differently. Empty lockers, silent break rooms, warning looks in the hallways. She jumped when the bell above the door chimed, but it was just Rodriguez entering. "Show me," Rodriguez said quietly, sliding into the booth. As Officer Chen's trembling fingers pulled up the files, Rodriguez's eyes widened. The footage showed a pattern. Miller's aggressive driving in certain neighborhoods, his accidents that always seemed to involve minorities, the way he'd casually file false reports afterward. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Diana's room had become command central for a different kind of investigation. Senator Chen had called in favors from every corner of his network. Civil rights lawyers huddled around laptops, analyzing the coffee shop's security footage. Tech experts worked to recover data from Diana's damaged phone. Community organizers coordinated with protest leaders, ensuring their message stayed focused on systemic change rather than revenge. Back at her office, Rodriguez pinned timelines to her wall, connecting incidents with red string like a scene from a crime show. But this wasn't television. This was real corruption with real victims. She added photos. A teenager with a broken arm from 3 years ago, a college student in a wheelchair from last year, and now Diana's hospital photo. All accidents, all covered up. Her office phone rang. Internal Affairs wanted updates. She could hear the pressure in their voices, the subtle suggestions to keep things proportionate. But as she looked at her wall of evidence, she knew there was no going back. This wasn't just about one bad officer anymore. It was about a system that protected him. Officer Chen left the coffee shop through the back door, clutching her secure drive. As she walked to her car, she noticed a patrol car slowly cruising past. Her heart raced until she recognized the driver. Another young officer who'd been silently watching, waiting for someone to take the first step toward truth. In the late afternoon, Rodriguez's team gathered in the conference room. The evidence was overwhelming. 15 years of covered-up incidents, dozens of victims who'd been intimidated into silence, and a network of senior officers who'd helped bury the truth. On the screen, they projected Diana's hospital photo next to Miller's falsified report, the lies in his words stark against the reality of her injuries. As the sun set, Rodriguez made one final call to Senator Chen. "We've got enough," she said simply. "Not just for Miller. For all of them." The silence on the other end lasted just a moment before the senator responded, "Do it." And Rodriguez? "Make it public. All of it." The investigation was about to blow the lid off decades of corruption. But as Rodriguez looked at her wall of victims, she knew this had never been about just one case or one officer. It was about breaking a system that had protected the wrong people for far too long. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, not just prosecution, but transformation. The streets of Washington, D.C. pulsed with energy as thousands gathered in front of the police headquarters. Hand-drawn signs bobbed up and down in the crowd. "Justice for Diana. End police brutality. No more cover-ups." The evening news helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing the sea of people that stretched for blocks. Mrs. Wu, the coffee shop owner, stood near the front, her small frame almost lost in the crowd. Just yesterday, she'd been quietly serving lattes. Today, she held a megaphone, her voice steady as she described what she'd seen through her shop window. "I saw an officer choose to hit a child," she said, her words echoing off the buildings. "Then I watched them try to hide it." Inside the police headquarters, Officer Chen watched through the windows, her heart racing. Other officers huddled in groups, whispering and shooting dark looks her way. Someone had taped the word Senat Chish to her locker that morning. Her hands trembled as she checked her phone. Another message from Rodriguez. Stay strong. Protection detail is in place. The protesters' chants grew louder as community leaders took turns speaking. A high school teacher described how Diana had tutored struggling students after debate practice. The owner of a local bookstore talked about her volunteering to read to kids every weekend. Each story painted a picture not just of Diana, but of a community united against injustice. Local news crews pushed through the crowd, trying to get interviews. Their cameras caught glimpses of faces both angry and hopeful. Elderly residents who'd seen too many years of abuse, young students who refused to accept it anymore, parents holding their children close as they demanded change. At City Memorial Hospital, Diana's hospital room television showed the coverage. She'd woken up that morning, groggy but alert. Now she watched in amazement as people she'd never met spoke her name, carried her picture, demanded justice in her name. Her father sat beside her, holding her hand, his phone constantly buzzing with updates from his team. Back at the protest, the mood shifted as someone projected Rodriguez's findings onto the side of the police building. The crowd fell silent as images appeared. 15 years of incident reports, each showing the same pattern. Names and faces of previous victims flashed across the wall, people who'd been silenced, intimidated, or simply not believed. Inside the building, Lieutenant Brooks frantically made calls, trying to contain the situation. But with each passing hour, more officers came forward. The thin blue line was cracking, revealing years of rot beneath. Young officers, inspired by Officer Chen's courage, began sharing their own stories of witnessing misconduct and feeling powerless to stop it. As night fell, candlelight replaced the angry signs. The protest transformed into a vigil, with thousands of flickering flames reflecting off the building's windows. Someone started singing an old civil rights song, and the melody spread through the crowd like a wave. In his apartment, Officer Miller watched the news coverage, his face pale. His phone had been ringing all day. Reporters, lawyers, even old victims who'd finally found their voices. The wall of protection he'd relied on for so many years was crumbling. His union representative had stopped taking his calls. The city council called an emergency session, responding to the public pressure. They voted unanimously to launch a complete review of the police department's practices. The mayor, seeing which way the wind was blowing, announced the formation of a civilian oversight committee with real power to investigate complaints. Near midnight, as the crowd finally began to thin, Mrs. Wu closed her coffee shop. The day's profits sat untouched in the register. She'd given away free coffee to protesters all day. As she cleaned up, she noticed new faces in her shop. Young officers, still in uniform, sitting with community members, talking quietly about change. The news crews packed up their equipment, but they knew the story was far from over. This wasn't just about one incident or one officer anymore. The people had found their voice, and they wouldn't be silenced again. In hospital rooms, living rooms, and street corners across the city, a new understanding was taking root. Real change was possible, but only if they stood together to demand it. As the last candles flickered out, Officer Chen finally left the station, escorted by 2 state troopers. She was exhausted but standing taller than she had in weeks. Sometimes, she realized, doing the right thing meant being brave enough to stand alone, until others found their courage to stand with you. The police department's break room felt like a battlefield drawn with invisible lines. Young officers sat on one side, their coffee cups forming a barrier between them and the veterans who'd known Miller for years. The morning news played silently on the wall-mounted TV, showing more footage of yesterday's protests. Officer Thompson, a 20-year veteran, slammed his locker shut. "This job's impossible now," he growled, looking directly at the younger officers. "Can't even do our jobs without someone crying harassment." A few older officers nodded in agreement, but more stayed silent, watching, thinking. By the windows, Rookie Officer Lee scrolled through his phone, showing his partner the social media storm. Every hour brought new stories from community members about past encounters with Miller. Some had been afraid to speak up before, but now their voices joined the rising chorus demanding change. Lieutenant Brooks sat alone in his office, staring at his badge on the desk. 30 years on the force, and now everything was falling apart. His phone buzzed. Another message from Internal Affairs. They wanted to interview him about past incidents he helped cover up. His hands shook as he poured his third cup of coffee. Down in the evidence room, 2 officers from the state police were going through old files. Every box they opened seemed to hold another story that should have been investigated, another complaint that had been buried. One of them, a veteran investigator, shook his head. How long did they think they could keep this hidden? The department's public information officer faced a room full of reporters, sweat beading on his forehead. We take these allegations seriously, he repeated for the 5th time, but the reporters weren't buying it anymore. They had documents, testimonies, video footage. The wall of silence was crumbling. In the parking lot, Officer Chen arrived for her shift, escorted by state troopers. The protection detail had become necessary after the threats started. But for every hostile glare she received, there were now 2 supportive nods from colleagues who'd found their own courage to speak up. The chief's secretary watched through the glass walls as senior officers filed into an emergency meeting. She'd worked here for decades, seen generations of officers come and go. But she'd never seen fear like this on their faces, not fear of danger, but fear of the truth coming out. Officer Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran, stood in front of his locker, looking at a photo of his daughter. She was Diana's age. The thought hit him hard, making him question every time he'd stayed quiet, every report he'd modified to protect a fellow officer. He took the photo down, tucked it in his pocket, and walked to Internal Affairs. By midday, the department's lobby filled with more reporters as news broke that 3 senior officers had resigned. The chief's statement cited personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth. The house of cards was collapsing, and everyone was trying to save themselves. In the detective division, veteran Detective Rivera closed another case file. She'd spent years building cases, only to have them mysteriously disappear when they involved certain officers. Now she pulled those old files out, spreading them across her desk like pieces of a puzzle she'd finally been allowed to solve. The afternoon shift change brought more tension. Officers who'd worked together for years now passed without speaking. Some wore small blue ribbons, a silent show of support for Miller. Others wore black bands, mourning what their badges had come to represent. Lieutenant Brooks finally left his office, walking past the break room where he had so many quiet conversations about handling things internally. Young officers who used to jump to attention now watched him pass with cold eyes, their silence louder than any protest. As evening approached, the department's counselor noted her schedule was fully booked for the first time in years. Officers were coming to talk about guilt, about fear, about the weight of secrets they'd carry. Some cried as they shared stories of times they'd wanted to speak up but couldn't. In the locker room, an old photo fell from Miller's locker, his academy graduation. He stood proud, young, full of promise. Now that same locker held evidence of how far he'd fallen, and how many he'd dragged down with him. A young officer picked up the photo, looked at it for a long moment, then quietly tore it in half. The sun set on a department divided, but maybe that division was necessary. Like a fever breaking an infection, sometimes things had to get worse before they could get better. Change was coming, not from the top down, but from within, from officers who'd finally decided that silence wasn't loyalty, and that real courage meant standing up for what was right, even when it hurt. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as camera crews set up their equipment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the granite steps where protesters had already begun gathering. Today was the first hearing in what the media had dubbed the Diana case, but everyone knew it was about much more than one incident. Inside, Diana sat in her wheelchair, her father beside her in the witness preparation room. Her legs still ached, but she sat straight, reviewing her statement one last time. The words blurred on the page as she remembered the screech of tires, the impact, the cold pavement. But she wasn't just speaking for herself today. She was speaking for everyone who'd never gotten their day in court. Down the hall, Officer Miller sat with his defense team, his once crisp uniform now feeling like it belonged to someone else. His lawyers shuffled papers, discussing strategy, but their voices held a note of resignation. The evidence was overwhelming, not just from Diana's incident, but from years of similar cases that had been buried. Rodriguez, the investigator, walked into the courtroom carrying boxes of evidence. Security footage, phone recordings, witness statements, and years of falsified reports. Each piece told part of a story that could no longer be ignored. She noticed Officer Chen sitting quietly in the back row, still under protection but determined to testify. The judge's chambers buzzed with activity as clerks reviewed last-minute motions. Judge Harrison had seen thousands of cases in her 30 years on the bench, but this one was different. It wasn't just about one officer or one department. It was about a system that had protected its own at the expense of justice. In the courthouse lobby, Mrs. Wu from the coffee shop hugged Diana's debate team members who'd come to show support. They wore matching t-shirts with "Truth Matters" printed across the front. Some held signs, others just held hands, drawing strength from each other as they prepared to face Miller for the first time since the incident. The courtroom filled quickly. On one side sat community members, activists, and victims from past cases. On the other, a handful of older officers who still supported Miller, though their numbers had dwindled as more evidence came to light. The tension in the room was thick enough to touch. Lieutenant Brooks entered last, summoned to testify about the cover-up attempts. His face had aged years and weeks. As he walked past Miller, their eyes met briefly. Former allies now on opposite sides of a divide that could no longer be bridged. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. All rise. Judge Harrison entered, her expression stern as she surveyed the packed courtroom. As she sat, the weight of history seemed to settle over the room. This wasn't just another hearing. This was where change would begin. Diana's testimony came first. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she described the incident. She spoke about waking up in the hospital, about the pain, about seeing the protests on TV. But most powerfully, she spoke about forgiveness, not to excuse what happened, but to show that justice wasn't about revenge. Officer Chen testified next, describing the culture of silence she'd encountered. Her voice carried across the courtroom as she detailed how reports were altered, evidence disappeared, and witnesses were intimidated. Some of Miller's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats as she spoke their names, their roles in the cover-ups. During a brief recess, Rodriguez watched Miller in the hallway. He stood alone, avoided even by his own lawyers. The weight of his actions seemed to physically press down on his shoulders. For the first time, he looked not like a corrupt officer, but like a man facing the consequences of years of unchecked power. When Mrs. Wu took the stand, she brought the security footage that had captured everything. As it played in the courtroom screens, there was no need for commentary. The truth played out in stark black and white. The deliberate acceleration, the impact, the casual indifference afterward. The day wore on as more witnesses came forward. Former victims spoke about similar incidents that had been buried. Young officers testified about the pressure to stay quiet. Each testimony added another brick to a wall of evidence that couldn't be ignored. As the sun set outside the courthouse windows, Judge Harrison called an end to the day's proceedings. But everyone knew this was just the beginning. In this courtroom, the system itself was on trial, and the verdict would echo far beyond these walls. 6 months later, the state capitol building hummed with anticipation. Diana wheeled herself to the podium, her father standing proudly behind her. The gallery was packed with faces from her journey: Mrs. Wu, Officer Chen, Rodriguez, her debate team, and countless community members who'd stood by her. The Thompson Police Accountability Act, Diana began, her voice clear and strong, isn't just about what happened to me. It's about building a future where every interaction between police and citizens is based on respect, not fear. She gestured to the thick document before her: legislation that would transform policing across the state. Body cameras would be mandatory. Civilian oversight boards would have real power. Training would focus on de-escalation and community relations. Most importantly, the blue wall of silence would be dismantled through whistleblower protections and mandatory reporting requirements. In the audience, Officer Chen sat with a group of young officers from her precinct. They wore new badges, redesigned to include the words "Community Guardian" beneath the shield. The change wasn't just symbolic. It represented a new philosophy of policing that was already showing results. Crime rates hadn't risen as critics had feared. Instead, community trust had grown. Citizens were more willing to work with police they saw as partners rather than adversaries. The number of complaints had dropped dramatically, while officer satisfaction ratings had improved. Mrs. Wu's coffee shop had become a kind of unofficial community center. Officers stopped by regularly, not to intimidate but to chat with residents. The security camera that had captured Diana's incident now mostly recorded friendly waves and community meetings. Diana's debate team had started a youth advocacy program, teaching other students about their rights and responsibilities when interacting with law enforcement. They even invited reformed officers to speak, building bridges between teens and police. Rodriguez, now heading the new oversight committee, shared statistics showing the impact of the changes. Use of force incidents had plummeted. Officer retention had improved. More importantly, officers were receiving counseling and support instead of being pressured to cover up mistakes. The vote was unanimous. As the governor signed the bill into law, Diana thought about the chain of events that had brought them here. One moment of hatred had sparked a movement for change. One act of courage, Officer Chen's decision to speak up, had inspired others to find their voices. Outside the Capitol, protesters gathered again, but this time in celebration. They released butterflies instead of carrying signs, symbols of transformation. Former adversaries stood together, united in their commitment to maintaining the changes they'd fought so hard to achieve. Diana rolled down to meet them, accompanied by her father. She stopped to hug Mrs. Wu, who whispered, "Your mother would be so proud." Officer Chen, now a surgeon, stood nearby with tears in her eyes. The young woman who'd barely survived a hate-driven attack had become a symbol of hope and healing. As evening fell, the Capitol's lights illuminated the crowd. Someone started singing Amazing Grace, and others joined in. The melody carried across the city, a reminder that justice, while sometimes slow, was possible when people refused to stay silent in the face of wrong. Diana looked up at the stars, thinking about how one terrible moment had led to so much positive change. Her injuries had healed, but the scars remained, reminders not of pain now, but of the power of truth to transform a broken system into something better. The Thompson Police Accountability Act would spread to other states, creating ripples of change across the country. But its real impact wasn't in the laws it created. It was in the minds and hearts it changed, proving that justice wasn't just a word in law books, but a living force that could reshape reality when enough people believed in it. The verdict came down like a thunderbolt on a clear day. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison began reading. Officer Miller stood, his face ashen, as the words "guilty on all counts" echoed through the chamber. But this was just the beginning. The evidence presented shows not just individual misconduct. Judge Harrison continued, her voice firm, but systematic failure at every level. She looked directly at Lieutenant Brooks and the other senior officers. Therefore, This court is recommending criminal investigations into all involved parties. Diana squeezed her father's hand as the judge detailed Miller's sentence. 20 years, no possibility of early parole. But more importantly, the judge ordered a complete overhaul of department policies, mandatory bias training, and the establishment of an independent civilian review board. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. Mrs. Wu hugged Officer Chen, both women crying tears of relief and vindication. The young officers who testified stood together, their badges gleaming in the sunlight, symbols not of power now, but of responsibility. Lieutenant Brooks was led away in handcuffs, along with 2 other senior officers. As they passed Miller, no one made eye contact. The thin blue line that had protected them for so long had finally broken, revealing the truth it had hidden. In his office, Senator Chen watched the news coverage while on a conference call with reform advocates. The verdict had given them momentum, and they weren't going to waste it. New legislation was already being drafted: stricter oversight, body camera requirements, civilian review boards with real power. Diana's debate team gathered in Mrs. Wu's coffee shop, where it had all started. They hung a photo on the wall. Diana at their last competition, smiling and holding a trophy. Beneath it, they added a plaque: "Justice begins with courage." At police headquarters, the changes started immediately. The new chief, a reformer brought in from another state, began by removing the old photos of past chiefs who'd allowed corruption to flourish. In their place, she hung the department's new mission statement: to protect and serve all people equally. Officer Chen walked through the station, no longer needing protection. Other officers nodded respectfully as she passed. She'd become a symbol of what the department could be. In the break room, young and veteran officers sat together, actually talking about how to rebuild trust with the community. The city council chamber was packed as they voted on the new Civilian Oversight Committee. Community leaders, activists, and retired officers would work together to review complaints and ensure transparency. The vote was unanimous, a first in the council's history. Diana started physical therapy, working to regain her strength. But she'd gained something else too: a purpose. She decided to study law, inspired by the prosecutors who'd fought for justice. Her debate skills would serve her well in a new arena. In his cell, Miller watched the news coverage of the department's changes. His former colleagues were cooperating with investigations, revealing years of misconduct. The wall of silence had crumbled completely, and with it, the system that had protected officers like him. The police academy's new training program included sessions led by community members, teaching cadets about the impact of bias and the importance of true public service. Officer Chen often spoke to these classes, sharing her story as a reminder that doing the right thing matters more than fitting in. As the sun set on the city, the changes were visible everywhere. Police officers walked their beats in pairs, stopping to talk with residents, building relationships instead of fear. Community meetings were filled with honest dialogue instead of angry confrontations. The case that started with one officer's racist act had triggered a transformation. It wasn't perfect. Change never is, but it was real. The power of truth had finally broken through years of silence, proving that justice could prevail if enough people stood up for what was right.